So for the first time in a while, this is actually at the designated time. Well, a little bit after 1:15. Okay, not bad. A little bit of housekeeping first. I will be giving a Parsha share next week for Parshat Tzav, and then I will not the following week because it's Olam Pesach, and I'm just going to take it off. And then the following week we'll return for Shmini, and there's going to be some variation with times given scheduling, the fact that I'm going to be at 2 different conferences in May and whatever. So again, it's on Facebook. You can find it. You know how to find me either here or on YouTube, even though right now I'm having an issue uploading to YouTube and it's going to a random other channel, but apparently people are seeing it. So whatever. Hopefully I'll fix that little technical detail at some point. This week we began the third of the Torah, the 5 books of Moshe, Parshat VaYikra, and I've entitled this, God is Found in the Details. There's a joke. A shul member has a serious problem that he needs to share with his Rav. He sends him an email to ask him the question, which involves trying to understand why the details of halacha or Jewish law are so important. Isn't it enough just to feel Jewish and to do things that feel Jewish? Why do we need all the details? We all know people who may consider this more than enough. Maybe sometimes we ourselves have. So, the rabbi thinks and sends him a very thoughtful response to his email immediately. Some days pass, and the gentleman becomes angry because he feels that his rabbi has ignored him because he did not receive the email. So he sends a repeat email, indicating that he's upset and repeating the initial question. The rabbi once again replies promptly. Again, the reply is not received. After several more back and forth attempts, the congregant is really furious with his religious leader and calls him to complain. The rabbi calmly explains that he returned the answer several times and he repeats the email. Ah, says the congregant, you forgot a dot in the address. It's AOL.com, not AOL.com. Ah, says the rabbi, it's just a dot. I guess this is why details are important. An anonymous Levite in Barcelona is credited in the 13th century with the authorship of Sefer HaChinuch. This treatise was meant to provide, in relative simplistic and easily comprehended language, the listing of all of the Taryag Mitzvot, the 613 commandments that are cited in the Sefer HaMitzvot, attributed to Maimonides, to Rambam, in the 12th century. While other such lists of these 613 mitzvot have been compiled based on our Torah, it is this list, given to us by Rambam, that is generally accepted due to its suggested user-friendly information doled out, with each mitzvah with a short explanatory note. In the Sefer HaChinuch, which follows the order and the framework of the original listing by Rambam, there is a more expanded discussion of these mitzvot, with 5 identical components for each one. 1, definition of the commandment itself. 2, a brief discussion of some of the fundamental laws involved in the commandment. 3, an explanation of the reason for the commandment. 4, a list of the general areas of discussion related to this mitzvah and the location of the Talmudic discussions of these areas. And 5, a summary to whom the commandment applies, when it applies, and consequences for its violation. Many may feel that we are left to ask, why are we so careful with these definitions and details? And why do we have so many additional scholars and texts who add to and further explicate these commanded actions that are a part of our lives as Jews throughout the generations? As Urshat Manji laments in her book, The Trouble with Islam, any model of this Jewish ongoing discussion of what we do and why we do it is absent in her religious texts and would help so much in maintaining the original intent of Islam and not devolve into what many have taken it to be today. If such were available, suggests Manji, perhaps we would not have the excessive violence, intolerance, and lack of understanding of the foundational values of this religion that she loves so much, both among groups in Islam and regarding other faith traditions as well. So here we are, about to begin the third of our Chamesh Chumshei Torah, with copious details regarding many dictated actions we may not understand, what we refer to as chukim. We do them because God commanded. We will be focusing on purity, on laws for the Kohanim, practices connected to the Mishkan and the worship there, just meticulously outlined and repeated several times in the last 5 Parashot of Shemot. We are taught that these commandments are indicated by Ribbonu shel Olam for reasons that we, as mere human beings, may not be capable of discerning. But nonetheless, the details are, yes, they are that important. As Rabbi Bernie Fox of the OU opines, if the Torah does not provide an explanation for the commandment, and there is no clear indication of its rationale in the traditional sources, then why speculate? Why not just allow the mystery of the commandment's reason to remain unsolved and recognize the limits of our knowledge? Fair. Simple enough question. But there is no simple answer. We as human beings, I often say, are given the capacity to want to and to understand that which we will never understand. But it doesn't mean that we stop trying. We want to know why we do what we do, as we discussed last week. We need to know why we do what we do. This is both the blessing and the greatest challenge of being the human beings we are, the people of reason and choice that Ribbonu shel Olam has created us to be. We're going to look briefly at 3 parts of these instructions in this first Parsha of VaYikra. Let us begin as we consider the very first commandment and set of instructions in our Parsha and Sefer of VaYikra, and then look at the context and the lessons that can be learned here. We read, Vaydaber Hashem al Moshe lemor, Daber al B'nai Yisrael v'amarta alehem Adam ki yakriv mikem korban l'Hashem mina be'em amina bikar mina tzon takrivu et korbanchem. Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when a man from amongst you brings a voluntary assent offering to God, you must bring your offering only from the cattle or from the flock. So, first of all, the use of the word Adam. Adam ki yakriv mikem. I teach gendered terms. I teach about what is gendered and what is not, and what is misappropriated as being gendered in the Torah often. And the use of the word Adam here is very instructive because it comes from Adamah, the land, an earthling. That is the proper translation of the word Adam, earthling, non-gendered, even though Hebrew is such a gendered language. But Rashi says, Adam ki yakriv mikem, if one wishes, one can bring these offerings. This involves voluntary offerings. And later in the Gemara, in Masechet Chagiga, we learn that if people want to bring offerings because of nachat ruach, because it makes them feel good, because it makes them feel like they're part of community, because they're included, because they really want to, then we do not stop them from doing so. So why does it say Adam? To teach us, the reference here, the second thought, is that it refers back to Adam, the first earthling who was called Adam, because just as Adam knew that he could never bring an offering from stolen property, you may not offer any stolen animal. So I want to suggest that Rashi's anticipatory lessons here are very interesting, given that the reality of the human being to exclude people, therefore only men can be part of the community, only men can, not the child, not the woman, not the person who's gender diverse, who's neurodiverse, all these things. And then we realize, no, that's not true, they can. That everyone can participate, number one. Number two, The second anticipatory lesson is that one might take for an offering something that is not his, and this is not acceptable. You must own the offering that you take, and there's this whole ceremony of stating ownership by what's called smicha, the inferring of a rabbinical office or investiture. But here it means to, smicha is to support or to say that it's yours, to place your hands on the animal, and it must be yours. Additionally, it also teaches, when it says tikravu, the plural form, that more than one person can bring one offering. So A, it's everybody. B, it has to be your property. And C, it can be a joint involvement. It then goes on and says, his sacrifice is an ascent offering, a higher offering, the Olam, one that goes up to God. Min bakar zachar tamim, it must be an unblemished male. He must bring it willingly to the tent of meeting before God, a male, not a female. And it says zachar. So this is interesting. Gender diversity was something that was known in the time of the Talmud and the commentators. It says zachar. Lo nekeva, kashu omer zachar lamata, she'ein Talmud lamar zachar v'lo tumtum v'androgonus. It can't be a female, it can't be a hermaphrodite, and it can't be an androgynous. It has to be a male. Why? Because it's a law, we don't know, God is asking that. But what's interesting to me is that whereas people are often discussing issues of who should be in the community and who shouldn't be in the community, like it's a new discussion, it's not. It goes all the way back. It is important to fully understand the nature of this exclusion as intended and not to assume or expand it for less than honorable purposes. Another joke. God checks in with Moshe, says, so Moshe, how's it going? And Moshe says, God, these people, they're waiting 60 minutes between meat and milk. They have separate dishes. They're making themselves crazy for cleaning, for Pesach. They're separate trash cans. They're like, what's going on here? And God says, this is nuts. All I said is, lo tefashel kedi b'chei mo. Don't seethe a kid in its mother's milk, which was a matter of humanitarian understanding. And from this, we get all of these isurim, all of these practices that we have to observe to the nth degree. So sometimes it's like pointillism. Sometimes the details go way off grid in terms of the initial intention. But this should be tamim. The offering should be without blemish. It should be this perfect male offering, and that is what is given to God as a korban, as a sacrifice. Then we read the samach, this is the smicha I mentioned, yado arosh ha'olav and yertzelo l'chaper alav, should lean their hand upon the head of the ascent offering, and it will be accepted to atone for him. So here again we have gender, v'samach, yado. But in Chagiga, it talks about, what about simicha kala? What about a light leaning on the animal? Well, who would lean lightly? Women. So it says, but wait a minute, the Torah doesn't say that women can bring offerings. So the Gemara comes in and says, yes, they can. If it's something that's meaningful to them, if it's spiritually fulfilling, they absolutely can. That's why we have these alternative words about how one leans on the animal. So this leaning indicates intention and physical involvement, association, communication with the offering that connects us to God. This will be repeated often enough throughout these instructions of how to offer sacrifices. You don't just, it goes back to Cain and Abel, you don't just throw it and say, here it is, but it's got to be very intentional. It's like intentionally praying. Or those of us that are artists, I see one on who's watching, you're very intentional about crafting what you're crafting. You don't just throw things together. So this leaning is involving intention and physical involvement, association, communication. This will be repeated often. It is not enough to just go through the motions, but one must follow all of the steps carefully. Now, let's look at the male gendering of the entire passage. An example of being careful with the continuum of exclusion, not using an animal that was used for idol worship. That's exclusion. Inclusion is what is conveyed by the word Adam, earthling, which counts for every human being. God wants offerings that are proper, that are not used for idol worship, and prepared in the dictated manner. Thus the reason for the copious details included in this Parshat and others that will follow regarding what to do. Back to Adam, that first set of offerings brought to God by Cain and Abel. Which offering was accepted? The one that showed preparation and thought, intentional gifting, not the one that was just randomly available. We, for our part, are to ensure that everyone is properly included, and then and only then will we be able to prepare and do as needed. Now we come to the second example I will use. If his sacrifice is a goat, ve'im as korbano v'hikrivu b'fnei Hashem, he must bring it before God. He must lean his hand upon it, and then Aaron's descendants will dash the blood. He brings the fat, the innards, and all required parts. The priest, the Kohen, must then burn them on the altar with the intention that it be pleasing to God. All fat belongs to God. And then this appears. Chukat Olam nedotechem b'chol moshvatechem kol chele v'kol dam lo tochlu. And this is the don't eat the blood, right? That balloons into all these kashrut requirements. It is eternally a law, a chuk, a law that you're not going to understand in any of your generations, in any of your places. But you do not consume the fat and you do not consume the blood. That is God's. So, returning to our Sefer HaMitzvot and Sefer HaChinuch, here we have two of our Taryag Mitzvot, of our 613 commandments, limiting what we can and cannot eat of the meat that we do consume, related directly to the offering of the sacrifices of the korbanot. Number 147 of the 613 commandments, according to Rambam, to Maimonides' count, says, any chalev from ox, sheep, or goat you may not eat. And 148 says, kol dam lo tachal, any blood you do not consume. These are both categorized as chukim, laws that may not make sense to us. Some of our rabbinic authorities do not even want to discuss reasons for these commandments. Years ago, there were all these texts coming out from medical resources saying eating blood is not good for you, eating raw meat is not good for you, we all know consuming lots of fat is not good for you. But in halacha, in Jewish law, just because God said so, that's enough. God is giving us limits. Don't look for medical reasons. Don't look for social reasons. Just accept it. That being said, we have many instances of such commandments that may not make sense acquiring reasons, though they may be secondary, as we progress in our lives. We know that eating fat is not healthy. We know that consuming blood can spread various diseases and cause illness. Learning that this is so does not mitigate against following the laws we follow because we are obeying the dictates of God. In other words, what I'm saying is that there are those that don't want to hear the reasons because they think, oh, well, if we find a law that doesn't have a reason, then we're not going to observe it. And there are laws that say, well, we'll observe it because it's a matter of health. What I'm saying is this is true and this is true. They do not work in counterbalance to each other. Just because it's healthy, just because it's a good thing, doesn't mean that God is not commanding it and that we don't do it just because God said so. For those of us who believe in God and think about that in terms of our lives. Even if such laws teach larger lessons, and they certainly do about discipline, for example, the value of limits, the sanctity of life, and so on, This could be seen as bringing God into our world through our intentional actions. Just as with the sacrifices, every detail is to bring the presence of God and to help that communication. Here, what we're saying is that if we think about being vegetarians or vegans and not eating meat because we don't want to eat life, not just not consuming the blood and not consuming the fat, but don't consume a living thing, that's not going against God. That's bringing God in through our actions, through our involvements. And there is a teaching that says, don't add, don't subtract. Don't say you're doing this because of health reasons. Don't say you're doing this because of tza'ar ba'alei chayim, concern for animals. But what's wrong with saying, I am concerned about that. I am concerned about God's creatures. I am trying to bring God into the world by my actions. They're not mutually exclusive, but I would suggest complementary. This is amplified when the restriction of not eating the blood of the animal is repeated later in the review lessons of Devarim, of the last book of the Torah, Deuteronomy. We read, Rachazek lebeti ochel adam ki adam hu nefesh v'lo tochal nefesh im basar. It says, be strong, don't eat the blood, because blood is the soul, and you do not eat the soul with the flesh. And this goes all the way back to Bereshit, where we're told, Lo tochel et adam. As I have stated in other shirim, korban, sacrifices, which is defined as sacrifice, does not convey the rooted meaning of this word in Hebrew, kuf, resh, vet. Karov means to come close, coming closer to God through giving something to God. Maybe the idea is better conveyed by the notion of what we call peshara, translated as compromise. But when we think of compromise, we often think of, what are we going to lose? This is actually all about by what we get, by giving, by coming closer to God intentionally. And with defined limits and dictates, we facilitate a most important connection. Here, for example, that connection brings together what we offer as korbanot to God, and how it helps formulate a framework for eating meat in our daily lives. For all my vegan and vegetarian friends, by observing the limits, by observing kashrut, assuming or hoping or ensuring that slaughter is done humanely, that it's done in a way not to cause pain, and it does feed in, pun intended, I guess, to a food chain where we are being responsible about how we are consuming. Think about the world of for example, the Native Americans, that when they kill an animal, they will use every single part of the animal for shelter, for clothing, for food, for, they don't waste any part of it. How intentional are we? How aware are we when we are eating what we are taking from the earth? Think about it that way. And in terms of a korban, it brings us closer to God to think about the earth that God created. Our third and final example from this Parsha that I will have us look at for its rooted meaning as well as its applied lessons is from chapter 4. Let us think for a moment of the members of the community as well as the leadership of that collective. This is particularly concerning to us today on many levels. We read, V'im kol adat Yisrael yishgu v'ne'alam davar me'einei ha'kahal v'asu achat mikol ha'mitzvot ad Hashem asher lo ta'asena v'ashema. If the entire community of Israel errs because of a matter, me'alam davar me'einei ha'kahal, because of a matter that eluded the eyes of the community, and the people transgress, therefore incurring guilt, then the sin that they committed is discovered. The community must bring a sin offering. They must bring before the tent of meeting. Adat Yisrael means the community of Israel. The Ne'alam Davar, Rashi is suggesting that we're talking about the leadership here, and it's kind of crowd mentality. Everybody's doing something that's wrong. The leadership is not saying stop. They're just sort of going along with it, or they're just, going out for coffee or whatever. and they continue to act in a certain way. Or the leadership gives a ruling that's incorrect and everybody follows it. This section ends with the following pasuk verse. V'samchu ziknei ha'ida al yadeim al rosh ha'par lifnei Hashem v'shachat et ha'par lifnei Hashem. The elders of the community go and take ownership of, they lean their hands on the bull's head before God, and then they slaughter the bull before God. In other words, the leaders take responsibility for the wrongdoing of the community. Here we see an iteration of the notion that Kol Yisrael arevim zeh b'zeh. All of Israel is responsible one for the other. And the leadership must lead the way of what this means and how it is activated as a foundational principle. We have seen this in other instances, and we will continue to do so through the book of VaYikra. The leadership must lead by following and show by example how to follow all the detailed instructions given them by God, whether or not they themselves understand what is being conveyed. This is why Ribbonu shel Olam calls out to each of us, asking us to do this in our own observance, in our actions, in our lives, throughout all of our dealings with each other, our community, and in our attempts to be the best we can be. When one proofs a text, as I often have to do multiple times for purposes of publications, which I often produce, or teaching, or communications of so many types, every dot counts and is needed. Because without the proper text, mistakes can and will occur, both small and large ones. And even small ones can be the largest missteps of all. Thus, let us all pay close attention to how we speak, how we communicate, how our leaders lead, how we follow the directions that are set before us intentionally, and of course, how we all come together as a community of faith and approach God. I wish Shabbat Shalom to all, and of course, I love this. Don't throw anything. Well, I'm on this side of the screen, so I won't get it anyway. Happy Pesach preparations, everybody. It's one of my favorites. Be well. See you next week. VaYikra.